Hey everyone, sorry it's been a little bit longer between videos than I would have liked. I was working on editing a longer video where we've got a setup together to do battle reports. I was working on our first kind of test run, and my old computer was a bit of a potato, and I cooked it. So, I had to get a new computer. So yeah, it's been busy, but finally set up to get things recorded again, and wanted to get back to work talking about Blades of Khaine. So, Howling Banshee aspect techniques. Let's first, I know we talked about it the last two times, but just go over the aspect technique faction rule one more time. Each aspect technique is in a category: Dire Avenger, Howling Banshee, and Striking Scorpion. Each aspect technique can only be used with a friendly operative that has the matching aspect keyword, and each will specify when it can be used and what its effects are. In addition, you cannot use more than one aspect technique per activation or counteraction. You cannot use each aspect technique more than once per turning point. And if every friendly Blades of Khaine operative selected for deployment has the same aspect keyword, e.g. Striking Scorpion, you cannot use each aspect technique more than twice per turning point instead of once. So, most important things here. What that means is that you can potentially have a single model use a number of different aspect techniques over the course of one turning point, but they have to be during different activations. So you can have a Howling Banshee use an aspect technique during their own activation. If somebody charges them, you could then use another. On a counteract, you could use a third. So you can end up using a lot of them on the same model, but those are all during separate activations. This is a really important distinction because some of the Howling Banshee techniques are quite useful on your opponent's activation. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about when to use them. But let's just get straight into it here. Excuse me. The first of the Howling Banshee aspect techniques is the Woe. Use this aspect technique during a friendly Howling Banshee operative's activation after it's performed the charge action and incapacitated an enemy operative during the fight action, and is no longer within control range of enemy operatives. That friendly operative can immediately perform a free charge action using any remaining move distance it had from that first charge action. That operative can perform 2 charge actions during its activation to do so. The operative cannot have performed any other actions during this activation, but can do so after resolving this aspect technique. So, let's break that down a little bit, because that's a lot to get through. A Howling Banshee Exarch can fight twice, and a Howling Banshee Warrior can use the Blade Wind deploy to be able to do a second fight action. So there's kind of the main way that you'll end up using the Woe, since it requires that you haven't done any other actions before you charge and then fight. The main way you use it is to spend your first APL to charge something, fight with a second APL, use the Woe to use your remaining charge distance to charge another thing, and then use your third APL to fight again. What this lets you do is it lets you get double kills and avoid having to charge multiple models at once to do so. Howling Banshees have the Banshee mask, so if you're initiating the fight action, your opponents are at -1 to hit, which is very useful. But if you have to charge into fights where your opponents then have combat support, and that essentially balances out the Banshee masks, it's a lot less good. So the Woe gives you a way to still get double kills in melee with your Howling Banshees and to play around combat support. And really that's kind of the only way you can use it for the most part, because it's got that clause right at the end saying that you cannot have done, this operative cannot have performed any other actions during this activation, but can do so after resolving this aspect technique. The other main way that you may use this in certain matchups is you may use it where you charge something, you fight something, and then you can do a second shorter charge just to tie something else up that you don't intend to fight. So charging expended operatives against horde teams that don't have a way to shoot into melee can be a really effective way to hide your Howling Banshees up the board score overrun safely, because your opponent's probably not going to want to have to charge you to fight the Howling Banshee. So that's kind of the other main way that you may end up using this, but really this is kind of all about getting those double fights and those double kills. Now, the second Howling Banshee aspect technique is Rain of Tears. And this technique is my absolute favorite. It's one of the best things about Blades of Khaine in my opinion, and it has so many uses. I'm going to run through some of the ones that I've found to be most common, but it really is super flexible, so the more you use it and the more you think about it, the more creative ways you'll find to implement it in your games. So first I should read the technique's text to you. Rain of Tears. Use this aspect technique when a friendly Howling Banshee operative is fighting. After you strike with a critical success, end that sequence, any remaining attack dice are discarded, and immediately perform a free dash or fall back action up to 3 inches with that operative. Then the fight action ends. That operative can do so even if it's performed an action that prevents it from performing the dash or fallback action. Alright, so I'm inserting another clip here because I forgot something very important when I was initially recording this video. So, the Rain of Tears technique does specify that it must be used when the Howling Banshee operative is fighting. That is fighting, not retaliating, because there is a distinction in Kill Team at the moment, and it is a very important distinction. You see the same thing on the Banshee Mask rule. So if you're fighting, if you're the operative doing the fight action with the Banshee Mask, they're at -1 to hit. Same thing with Rain of Tears. If you're doing the fight action, you have the option to strike with a crit and then end the combat. If the enemy is doing the fight action, so you're retaliating, you do not have that option. Now, this technique is still really good, but it would be absolutely busted if somebody charged you, they hit you once, and then you're like, don't love that, crit them for 6 damage and run away, and then they're stuck. Just wanted to make sure I explicitly included that in this video. We'll go ahead and get back to the initial recording. Now, as I've said in the previous 2 videos, any techniques that give you additional movement or action economy are really good. But the other great thing about this technique is that it can be really unpredictable for your opponent to try and play around. Sure, in some games there will be some super straightforward places you need to use this, but in others you can get really weird angles or get into places a model couldn't normally reach and really disrupt your opponent's plans or deny crit op or tac ops. And because the ability isn't tied to one particular model's data card, like a normal specialist on other teams, it's really hard for your opponent to predict what you might do with Rain of Tears. So, like I said a moment ago, here are kind of the 4 main ways that I end up using this. First, Howling Banshees have power swords, which is great, and lethal 5-up. So, on your 4 attacks, you'll usually get a crit. And we do have access to, potentially, Ceaseless, although I don't use it often. But you only have 4 attacks. So sometimes you'll charge a model, you'll get a crit and a hit, and your opponent has enough attacks to parry you out. And, they may survive on 1 or 2 wounds and they can kill you. Not ideal. So instead, you can use this aspect technique to bail out of a fight you would otherwise lose. Your first hit, because you're the one that charged, so you go first, you resolve your crit, you deal 6 damage, and then you fall back 3 inches away and then shoot at them or something, or complete a mission action. But it can be a sort of escape mechanism for a Howling Banshee that gets a crit but otherwise just doesn't roll what they need on an attack roll for melee. The second way that I use Rain of Tears is when I'm too far from something. So that could be too far from an objective marker that needs to be tapped, from a space where you need to be to plant that last beacon for your tac ops, or if I just absolutely need to finish off a model that's stuck on 1 wound but it's too far away to move and shoot it with a pistol. So instead, you charge a different enemy model, crit it, then use that 3-inch fallback to get deeper into enemy territory or to get around a bit of terrain in order to get the angle that you need to shoot, or to get that extra bit of distance that you need to get into range to plant your beacons, or to deny contain. So it can give you that extra movement on top of a charge move to really get you across the board. Third, against elite matchups, you'll often end up using this technique to, charge a Space Marine just to try and get one crit, deal 6 damage to them, then bounce away with Rain of Tears before they can swing back at you. 14 wounds is a lot for our team to get through in one fight action, but if you chunk them down to 8 wounds, then any other Banshee or Striking Scorpion can kill them with just 2 normal hits. So Rain of Tears becomes your chip damage that enables your other models to get killed more easily. And fourth, if you start a Howling Banshees activation in engagement, and you don't want to be there, you do have the option of using a Firefight ploy to fall back for one AP less, but spending a command point, which I always wish I had more of, and an APL just to fall back, I don't love it. Or spending 2 APL, you can't do a whole lot else. Or you just fight, get a crit, deal damage to them, and fall back, and then you have 2 APL to do other things with. So it's got a lot of different uses. It's a very flexible aspect technique, and this is one that you will probably end up using most turns if you're running any Howling Banshees and Blades of Khaine. Excuse me. So, the third aspect technique for Howling Banshees is the Shriek that Kills. Now, this is another great ability. This is the only aspect technique that gives a model a whole new ranged weapon profile that's not on their data card. It is just for one action, so you cannot scream multiple times in a single activation, even if your model can shoot twice. A Banshee Exarch cannot scream twice, but there are a couple of really important things going on in this technique. First, it has Seek Light and Saturate. This makes it very reliable against models in light cover mid-board that might otherwise be hard to get rid of. Second, it has Torrent 1. It's only 1 inch, but it's the only access we have to Torrent, and if your opponent does bunch models up, you can potentially hit a couple of them. And on Into the Dark, or inside of a Volkis stronghold using the close quarters rules, Torrent gives this weapon lethal 5-up as well. Because you have 6 attacks, your odds of getting crits and stunning your opponent are very high on IGD or Volkis. Against crowded enemy models, this could potentially stun multiple enemies, which could be absolutely huge. Third, this technique has 6 attacks hitting on 3s. And if you're playing the strategic ploy Khaine's Vengeance, you'll get Ceaseless when shooting expended enemy operatives. Since defending operatives only get to roll 3 defense dice against shooting, this technique can be a really reliable way to take that last 2 or 3 wounds off of an enemy model that you need to finish off, that you've left at low wounds and just can't reach to finish them in melee. So that's one of the most common ways that I end up using this on, even on open boards when I'm not able to get the lethal 5-up. It's great for finishing things off. And fourth, if you take a Mirror Sword Howling Banshee Exarch, they do not come with a pistol. This technique, or if you choose to bring them grenades, will be the only way that those models can perform a ranged attack. And if you're taking a Mirror Sword Exarch, it's probably because you're not planning to have to make a whole lot of ranged attacks with that model. Sure. But this is a very useful option if you're taking that particular loadout. And fifth, I kind of alluded to this earlier, but the Shriek that Kills has stun. So if you get a crit through, you're dropping the APL of the target model. And that's very useful against APL 2 teams, because then they, if you stun them, they could potentially charge, but then they can't fight you. Or they can shoot at you, but then they can't move further away, and they're within 6 inches. So it's a huge problem for APL 2 teams. APL 3 teams certainly don't like it. It's just not quite as punishing. But it's important to keep that in mind, because it also affects how enemies are able to control points. Ideally, you're finishing off enemy models, and you're not in a situation where your only way out of the game with a victory is to stun a couple things and run on to points in order to steal them away. But it's important to know that you have that option if you need it. Alright, so the fourth aspect technique for Howling Banshees is acrobatic. Use this aspect technique when a friendly Howling Banshee operative performs an action in which it moves. Until the end of the action, that operative, 1, can ignore all vertical distances when it drops and climbs. 2, can move through enemy operatives, move within control range of them, and during the charge action can leave their control range. It must still end the move following all requirements for that move. And 3, cannot move more than its move stat if it's the charge action. So this is the technique that makes Howling Banshees really, really good on Volcus, or really any terrain set that has large vertical distances. And on those open maps, against most teams, this is the tool that lets us get longer threat ranges and really control the board. But Milton, I hear you ask, how are we getting longer threat ranges if when we use acrobatic to charge, we don't get to use our full 9-inch charge range and only get 7 inches? Well, the answer is that everything is relative. If you're playing on one of the Volcus maps where you can put a Howling Banshee, say, up on the top floor of the stronghold, go ahead and set up a board for yourself. Put that model up there. And then measure out 7 inches horizontally from your model. Don't even think about vertical distance, because with this technique, you don't need to. That's how far you can charge from up there. And any models trying to get up to you would have to climb up a ridiculous height. So that's the most extreme example. But let's say you have a Howling Banshee hiding inside one of the strongholds on the ground floor. Your opponent would have to come in through a door, so they might have to come in through a door and then move over sideways to get to you. They might not be able to reach. Or they would have to climb over the top and then drop down. It's going to be really difficult for them to do. But you don't care. You can just charge up and over, climbing and dropping as far as you like. You can only go 7 inches horizontally. But if your opponent would have to climb 6 inches up and drop down another 4, they just can't make that charge at all, regardless of the horizontal distance, unless they have a special rule that changes things for them. So you end up with a much larger functional threat range than your opponent, even if you can't make that full normal 9-inch charge movement. Now this is less useful on Into the Dark, but it can still let you climb over barricades that are in the way, and so you may get some use out of it, but it's less good there. Now there are other models in the game that can potentially match your threat ranges with this, so it's important to keep in mind things like climbing ropes if your opponent has them, where ladders are located, and to keep in mind models like Void Dancer Troop or Warp Coven Sorcerers or Phobos Reavers that all have their own special rules that let them fly or ignore some component of climbing and dropping. But if you keep those things in mind, you can start to really control space around the battlefield with the acrobatic technique. And you can either do that by throwing a model up there really early, and then if you win initiative, you can go first and charge off of that vantage and really pin people back towards their own deployment. What I usually end up doing a lot of the time is I prioritize my shooting more. I tend not to use the strategic ploy to get ceaseless on melee against ready operatives. So I tend to use my melee pieces later in a turning point, and then I tend to use them, I'll let my opponent, they know what my threat ranges are. I'll usually ham-fistedly measure them out so that they're aware if you come into this range, I'm going to come after you. But I usually try to use my melee pieces to clean up instead of being that first strike. So, I'll let people come onto points initially, but I know that if they do, I can charge them with a Howling Banshee, and then I kind of build my plan around that. The final aspect technique for Howling Banshees is the Scream That Steals. Use this aspect technique when a friendly Howling Banshee operative is fighting or retaliating at the start of the Resolve Attack Dice step. You can resolve one of your successes before the normal order. If you do, that success must be used to block. So this one's fairly simple, but it's very useful. Because Howling Banshees obviously want to be in melee the majority of the time, so any melee tricks are really good. This technique, you can use it when you're fighting or retaliating, so even if your opponent charges and fights you, you can still use it. And what it lets you do is parry with one of your dice before the attacker resolves any dice. So if your opponent, just so a couple of the examples in the game, if your opponent is playing something like Legionaries with a Khorne Butcher or a Khorne Chosen, and they're guaranteed to get a crit that hits for 8 damage, and they charge you, you roll your 4 dice, you have lethal 5 up, you get a crit, so you can parry out their 8 damage crit before they get to swing. Then they have to swing and hit you for, it's either 5 or 6 damage depending on the model. You're still alive to hit them once before they kill you, instead of you just getting one shot. So it can allow you to get a little bit of additional damage through against certain models. It's also really useful in situations where you have enough damage to kill your opponent, but they have one success. It can let you parry before they get to swing at all. Make it a little bit faster and easier to parry them out, so it can keep your models alive, or it can set you up in positions where you're charging to completely parry out your opponent before they would get to do anything. If you are the attacking model, then you can use the one parry before the attacker gets to resolve any dice, and then you can resolve the first die as the attacker, so you could potentially parry twice before your opponent gets to do anything. Really, the more you fight in melee and just think about the Scream that steals, the more situations you'll see where it's actually really useful. And between this and the Rune of Shielding, we'll talk about equipment in a little bit, you can potentially blank a couple of damage dice, and get your Banshee through fights that they really ought to otherwise lose. The other thing that's nice about this is that Howling Banshees are pretty good in melee. I find that the power swords are a little bit more useful than the Scorpion chain swords into certain damage points, so I tend to run a lot of Howling Banshees in my team compositions. It's not unusual for me to be running 4 in a mixed team. And this makes them really good into other people's melee operatives. So, enemy melee teams that don't hit, have a ton of dice and don't have super reliable hit stats, like Felgor Ravagers, for example. They can really struggle with a lot of Howling Banshees because they've got some models that hit on 4s, and as the Blades of Khaine player, you can use Scream That Steals to really mess with their combat math. You can also use the Contempt Firefight ploy, which we'll talk about in a little bit, to do the same, as well as the Rune of Shielding. So it might not seem like all that much on its own, but as you start to kind of layer these various defensive tools together, anytime your opponent rolls slightly bad, should have something kind of light up in your head like, okay, here's an opening I have to use one of these tools to really crush their hopes and make what seems like, a not great situation into a really terrible situation for them. So, that's all 5 of the Howling Banshee aspect techniques. I will go ahead and get this edited and posted up as soon as possible here. And the next video that I'm going to be putting out will be talking about the strategic ploys and the firefight ploys for Blades of Khaine. A lot of the content we've gone over so far is me reading rules to you and giving you some commentary on how to use them, but it's hard to kind of put all the pieces together, right? So we're almost to the end of having to go over all the rules for the team. We'll talk about the ploys, then we'll talk about equipment, and then my plan is to start talking more about matchups and about terrain layouts and some different ways that we can use the things that we'll have already discussed at that point to put together a comprehensive game plan. So thank you for sticking with me. I know it's been a lot of time just listening to me talk to you about rules. but we're almost to the really fun part. Thank you for sticking around. If you're enjoying the content, please like and subscribe to the channel. We'll be putting out more Blades of Khaine material very soon, and we're also putting out, as I was talking about earlier, our first battle report. Working on editing that tonight. So thank you all, and I'll see you soon.